Now, we're going to change tacks, and biodiversity and the role of investing in nature is an evolving theme with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. Quite a mouthful. What does it all mean? Joining us now via Skype is Dylan Ashton from Equity Trustees to shed more light on the topic. Dylan, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Let's have a look at biodiversity. We're hearing a lot more about it, and we're hearing a lot more about it in the context of how investing can play a role in this space. Can you touch on what are some of those trends at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So I was actually recently in Japan at a conference, a global sustainability investment conference run by the Principles of Responsible Investing. And it was really great to hear from some of the leaders in the responsible investment space from around the world and some of the key ESG areas that they're focused on moving forward. So biodiversity was definitely one of those topics that kept coming up in conversations throughout the 3 days. I think that, climate and climate-related financial risks to business are very well understood by investors, but biodiversity and the understanding that biodiversity, nature and climate change are all interlinked are starting to increase in awareness. And there's also an increased understanding that biodiversity and nature have an impact on our economy. And there was a report released by the World Economic Forum, and they mentioned that 50% of global GDP relies on nature to some extent. So we expect it will be an increased area of focus for investors and companies moving forward. But we are still in the very early days of understanding where biodiversity impacts and dependencies are. Some companies are starting to make small steps and some progress, but it does mean it will pose a challenge initially for investors, given the data and the information available is quite limited at the moment. But there was the release of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures in September. So we are seeing some significant momentum in the space, and these disclosure recommendations will really help businesses and investors understand where those risks and opportunities are. And the more companies that take up those recommendations, the more helpful it will be for investors to identify the risks within their portfolios.
So Dylan, the TNFD, these are recommendations about disclosures, I assume, impacts on nature and biodiversity, or conversely, you have both positive and negative impacts. They're not compulsory at this stage. Are they only kind of recommendations that they're working down the track to putting in place something more substantial?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the TNFD are voluntary disclosure recommendations, and they're basically been designed to help companies understand where their impacts on biodiversity and nature are, and also where their dependencies are, and start reporting on those risks and opportunities. But they're not mandatory yet. There is talk of them becoming mandatory down the track, and I'd expect in the next 2 to 3 years you'd see that they'll become mandatory reporting disclosure requirements.
When we look at the trends and where everything's going, particularly for pension and super funds that have very long time frames, so they have to assess risks and opportunities, particularly within the context of this. What are some of the opportunities that will be presented for investors?
Yeah, so it's a really good point, and that's why this is quite important, because it does look out to the very long term. But for investors, given its early stages and the data and information isn't quite available, it is a great opportunity for them to have a look at their portfolios and understand where the businesses that they're invested in are geographically located, have a deep understanding of their operations and their supply chains to try and identify where those risks might be. But it's also a great opportunity for investors to start through their engagement activities and using their access to boards, company directors and management teams to question them on where they're at with understanding where their businesses are dependent and impacts nature, and what they're doing about it, and when they expect to start reporting on those risks and opportunities.
Dylan, when we look at this sector, because there's a lot particularly coming out of Europe on this, and it's always interesting to try and gauge how much is coming from, I suppose, a top down. So organisations such as yourselves wanting to be involved, looking at the new regulations, versus investors, and how much push there is coming from them. Is there much push from investors to improve, I suppose, improve the metrics in this space?
Yeah, I think there definitely is. And I think that a lot of the push has been initiated by investors, and then we've seen that the regulations start to follow. Europe is definitely leading the way with regulation, and it's certainly gaining pace here in Australia. And for investors, I think that that is one key area to be focusing on because it is developing rapidly. So we've already seen the reforms to the safeguard mechanism released the 1st of July this year. We're seeing that the environmental laws are currently being overhauled, so it'll be interesting to see how they turn out next year when they're released. And I expect that biodiversity and nature will be a key feature of those. There's also been discussions on Australia implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which Europe have already done. So these regulations and developments in this space will be a really important area for investors to keep an eye on, and particularly the changes in regulations and the impact that that could have on their portfolios.
Okay, and one last question. What are the factors? What should investors be aware of or watching out for in terms of, any potential greenwashing or other factors like that?
Yeah, so look, ASIC are really cracking down on greenwashing, as we all know. But I guess having a look at companies and what they're doing, the amount they're spending, how they're approaching their sustainability issues and reporting on them, and how transparent they are really important. When it comes to biodiversity and nature, we've already seen some companies make significant steps in that space. So BHP were probably one of the leaders, and they've been a part of developing the TNFD. And they've also set some targets already in terms of having nature positive solutions for 30% of their land and water by 2030. Brambles are also in the space and doing a really good job in terms of target setting. They've included nature in their remuneration framework, and they've committed to planting more trees. So I think it's important to understand what these companies are targeting, and also ensuring that they're meeting those targets.